This video will go through the effects I made for the Combaticons, such as the thrusters, lasers, and explosion effects. The references Keyan had given me were from a demo reel of Cyberverse animation effects. These were some isolated elements, such as the smoke, fire, blasts, and pieces and splashes. At first I was unsure how to make these. I could have made them 2D and then composite them on top of the animation after, but this wouldn't interact with the 3D models as well, and it would seem pretty artificial to me. It also wouldn't light the scene either. But I also didn't want to do custom particles for every single individual scene. Because I was going to use these all over the place, I wanted to just be able to drag and drop them on. So I opted to make them partially procedural and make them a bit modular, so I could split them into different pieces and then combine and vary them, and it would give me a lot of variation and customizability when spammed everywhere. It also meant I could make them more detailed as they would get reused. The first effect I made was a sort of fiery explosion. This was an attempt to try and animate it all on a single card, and it would just be applied to a single shader, but I soon found out that this wasn't going to work because I'd need to cut around it in order to have it fit with the shading and line art. But its nodes were fairly simple. It was just to make a single point and then have a noise on top that would just shoot out fiery sparks. This was mainly inspired by Peric's tutorial on explosion effects. They're very good and I highly recommend you watch it. So this explosion was a good base, but I needed other effects to go on top of it. So then I tried doing a splash effect to act as a bright directed blast, which was mostly inspired by Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3's Hit Sparks. Essentially just a couple of circles cut out of a sheet. I used the shader nodes to generate the shape on a single plane in a straight line, and then I used a simple deform modifier which would let me splay it out, giving it the exaggerated proportions at the end. It also gave me a bit more options with animating it as well. I then needed to do some smoke charges. This I was most tempted to do as a 2D thing, and I really struggled trying to figure this out. This was before I knew more about geometry nodes, and if I were to do it now I'd have a much better way of trying it, but I still need to sort of iron out the issues on that one. But with the way I did it before, I essentially just made a ball mesh and I gave it a different shape key for each frame. I sculpted a different shape on each shape key, and I would change shape key each frame. I would adjust the sculpting each frame just to make sure it went into itself. I did this several times so that I had a few different smoke shapes to pick from. This took the longest to make, and I'd use it extensively on the explosions, so I think it was worth it. I later found out you could also do this much more easily if you had relative turned off, but I didn't know this at this time. The benefit of having it as a single object meant that I could rotate it and change it at will. I could even add modifiers on top of it, so I didn't have to swap between multiple objects. I also made some smaller bits just so that I could use them to enhance current effects. This was like a blast ring and some small sparks. These are greatly inspired by Peric's other tutorial on the same explosion. The thrusters, however, had to be a bit more custom. I wanted them to be specific and unique per ship, and these also needed to be controllable and animatable. I used displacement modifiers and then controlled their strength with a rig. I also threw in a couple of shape keys and some weight groups so that I could only move specific parts of it when I wanted to animate them. The intensity and noise could be mapped to the rig, which made the animation very easy, so I would just move this control and have it grow larger or smaller. They were made of individual parts. The design here is mostly a sphere hidden within another sphere that both had the same weight group, but one was slightly less intense. And then I'd map them both to the displacement modifier, and then that would add the noise, which would make it deform outwards. And then this would be driven by the rig. Having two spheres inside of each other, if you invert the normals on the outermost one and have the shader set up so that it lets the back facing through, then you could have it shade as if there was a bright white intensity and then the red coming off of it. The other small fighter ships, on the other hand, I wanted to deliberately make them different. So I made them a more bubbly effect. And this was done with fairly similar setup as before, two meshes inside of each other, but this time it was a different noise texture, and they would have bubbling outwards as well. So I added on two cards rotated 90 degrees tangent to each other, and these were spewing bubbles constantly. I really wanted to figure out how to do trails in this, because this would help the eye follow the ship's direction in the animation. This was done by rigging a section of a mesh, which had a long effect on it. So it was a long just trail of red that tapered towards the end. And then each bone along the length of the trail would control a small portion of the tail. And then you could animate this path by moving the ship and having the ship whole body animated. And then you have an empty, you bind it to the start of the trail, and you use a copy transforms constraint to have it copy it completely. And then you bake the animation on the empty, and then in the animation curves, delay them by a few frames, and then have the next bone along the chain follow that empty again. This meant that the trail would always perfectly follow the ship, but it would need to be redone every time you edited the animation of the ship. The ships had one more effect on the interior. This was some connecting energy that was meant to keep the middle in place. This was made out of a single curve that had some extrusion on it, and then I applied this shader on top. This was a procedural shader that was entirely animated with nodes. I ended up using this in some other places for the ball and energy gathering effects, and the basic principles still apply here. I'm showing the nodes, but for more info on how to design stuff like this, I highly recommend the Blender Cloud Shading Nodes video. Most of them are free, and they do an incredibly good job of explaining the fundamentals. For the lasers, I found that making a tube and having the white colour tube inside of it with the emission in the middle worked out quite well. This is the same setup as the thrusters, where you have the outer shell inverted normals and then have the shader make sure it has back face culling on. So this meant that it would look the same from every angle and wouldn't feel like a single solid object. And since it moved so fast, I didn't need to add a lot of detail to it. I stuck with the rounded one for the smaller ships and then made a square rectangular one for the bigger ships. I also threw in some small sparks for the contacting, and I also made an electricity beam for variation. The electricity beam was mostly just displacement modifiers along a single line of vertices. This had some hook modifiers so that I could attach some parts of the mesh to other parts of the ship, and then I could just parent them and it would follow. And it would also just have a skin modifier to give it some thickness and then displace on top of that again. Oh, and a side note about rendering out glow on transparent backgrounds. There is a great video that explains exactly why this is the case, especially in Blender. And the short answer is you need to render two passes, one with the colour on the black background, and then one with a transparent mask of what you actually want to see. And then you just go into whatever editor you're using afterwards, and just have the colour layer set to addition on top of the transparent one. And this will carry over the glow from whatever tool you're using to another tool. So that was the end of the modular effects. And now the rest are more custom ones, but they may use some of the modular ones inside them. There was one shot where I had to have the big villain form out of a bunch of energy, and this was a big experiment with geometry nodes for me, where I modelled a very basic form and I wanted to construct it out of the volumes of the mesh. This was mostly done by making it a mesh that became a bunch of volumes, and have those volumes scatter, and then have them form back into a mesh again. So it went from mesh to volume to mesh. And then I threw in some lightning sparks, which would then spike on the surface. Something I'll say is you should not be afraid of reusing old effects and just changing the color or changing the settings a bit. That really helped me with this. A lot of the main big scenes and effects have a bunch of layered stuff on top of it. It's quite hard to go back and show you all of it just because everything's been thrown together in one big pot. There was also this massive energy ball that formed during this part. This was another case where I had a few components work together. I used the big energy trail from the ship, and I had that ringed around the big ball. And on the inside was two spheres inside of itself with a displacement modifier animated, and then the splash effects, but this time red, and they were randomly changing angles every single frame. I also animated the scale to change with the growing energy. You could also animate the intensity of the light as well. There was another effect I had to do, which was a dissolving pink balls effect. This happened on the ship and on the main character using it. This was a node group that I used that would allow a shader to be normally rendered on top, but the control of the pink balls dissolving would be done from another object, meaning that it would dissolve any material into the balls in transparency. The nodes on screen are mostly just the same thing from the energy trail. A gradient moves up, the balls fly off, and as the object that sources it moves the gradient across, and hides the bit you don't want to see, and hides the bit around the balls, and then shows the bit after it. And the last one I'll show is this pulsing energy ball. This was mostly rotating spheres inside of each other, with inverted normals again, but this time it had a new effect, which was the splash, but in reverse, so it was now moving all the energy towards it, but it had a different node setup. This one I decided to make especially brand new, just because it had been a while since I was doing it in real time. But this also had the added effect of having another sphere on top of it, which was pulsing energy outwards in this case. And this would be Boolean, so that it would only have the energy appear on the outside of the ball, so you could still see what was inside of it. Then on the inside, there was sparking electricity again. This was using a shrink wrap modifier, so that it would put the vertices on the outside edge of the sphere, and then it would randomly distort it and noise it.